Hello, and welcome to the Six Figure Developer Podcast, the podcast where we talk about new and exciting technologies, professional development, clean code, career advancement, and more. I'm John Calloway.
I'm Clayton Hunt.
And I'm John Ash.
With us today is Doc Norton. Doc is co-founder at On Belay, performing organizational and leadership coaching to companies for whom software is key. Welcome, Doc.
Well, thank you. Good to be here.
So, Doc, before we get started, would you just give our listeners maybe an introduction to yourself? Kind of tell them how you got started in the industry.
Yeah, sure. So, getting started was a long time ago. I've been in software for about 35 years, 30 professionally, 35 when you add in my being a hobbyist. So, early 80s, TRS-80, Model 2, doing some basic stuff. And then after college, got a job, and it turned out that I was the only dude in the place that was brave enough to change the paper in the printer, which ultimately qualified me to be the computer room technician. And it kind of went from there. I got a night job swapping tapes and started really studying languages then because I had so much time at night, and became a developer and kind of gone from there.
Okay. Yeah. So these days, what are you doing these days? What's that like?
Yeah. So gone from there is leaves a pretty big gap, doesn't it? So that led to my own consultancy, ran that for 15 years, and then moved into leadership positions in organizations. I've always tried to keep hands-on keys. So, in the last few years, I do a lot of agile technical coaching, some leadership coaching, oftentimes in larger organizations. I'm going in and sometimes getting embedded with teams, but have always kind of try to keep the chops as well. So a lot of languages. In the last decade, it's been mostly Ruby and Java, but I've dabbled in lots of stuff.
Oh, that's very cool.
Yeah.
And I know a while ago you had started on a series on technical debt. Are there any plans on continuing that series or kind of expanding out from there?
Yeah. So that's a series with Clean Coders. They've got a bunch of content there, and yes, there is actually plans for that. So I started those a few years ago after a discussion with Uncle Bob, and I owe them at least two more. I'm actually right now in the process of writing episode 3 and plan on either 4 or 5, depending on exactly where the content goes. So. That's been a lot of fun. It's been interesting. Bob's got a particular style. It's not quite comfortable for me to do the same things that he's done. And so they've given me a little bit of latitude. And the first 2 in the series, I think, really kind of introduced the metaphor and the concept and that. And now as we move forward, actually want to start talking about ways that we clean code and work with legacy code. And what are we looking at in terms of really cruft remediation. I don't consider messy code to be technical debt. So
you're saying you're not comfortable filming while you're in the shower? That's
yeah. So that would be one of my boundaries. Yes.
So I actually bought that series when it was first coming out, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. One of the things that I thought was interesting was the definition of technical debt that you gave, because it is very much different from the industry accepted definition of technical debt. Would you like to go over that now so that maybe we can share that with the audience?
Yeah. So technical debt's got a long history, right? And the definition that I use is really the original intent of the phrase. And when it gets down to it, technical debt is fundamentally nothing but the gap between what has been currently implemented and what we now know that we need. And if you look at the history of it, without going into a ton of detail, so Ward Cunningham coined the phrase, 1992 OOPSLA paper, where he was actually sharing an experience that he had. He was working on the YCash portfolio management system. So he's working on a financial system back in the early 90s and explaining to his client why was he going back into code that had already been changed and touching it again, that had already been completed and touching it again? And so what he was really talking about was refactoring, and that type of work that we do as we're evolving solutions. But they were a financial institution, and they understood debt, especially at that time, late 80s, early 90s, as something that is risky. But the intention was, what we're talking about is code that is well composed, that is well tested, and it happens that either deliberately, right? Like we want to do a fancy search with dropdown, but the first thing we're going to do is just a basic search. So we know we want dropdown, but we just delivered the basic search. That's technical debt. Or maybe we discovered it. We put something into production and then came to realize that, like, oh, we thought they wanted that, but really they want this. Technical debt. In order to have technical debt by Ward's definition, you have to have well-composed, well-covered code that is easy enough to refactor to get it to where you want it to be, within a reasonable amount of time. So clean code was a prerequisite to technical debt at one time. And we look at, here we fast forward, 20 years, please tell me it's 20, no, 30. And man, and suddenly technical debt means the opposite.
Yeah.
In the industry, it means like, crufty stuff you've slapped together.
Yeah. These days I see more and more people are just, we're creating some technical debt. We're throwing together something that almost works. If you squint at it right, then it works.
Yeah.
We're just going to slap it together. We're going to push it out, and we're never going to talk about it ever again, because there's never enough time to go back and fix our past mistakes.
Yeah, and I think this is a mistake for us as an industry. I think that what we're doing is we're normalizing bad behavior. And so part of the series, one of the things that I do is we take a look at what would technical debt look like in other industries. When it becomes pretty obvious that it's ridiculous that you'd accept this type of behavior, right? If you've got, someone has built a wall that is literally cutting a toilet in half, why would you do that? That's obviously unprofessional behavior.
Half
and
a
yet
toilet still flushes.
Well, it's okay, true, right? Yeah, it's all about precision, right? But in software, we do this kind of thing all the time, and because it's sort of behind the scenes, you can't see it, sort of thing. We just sort of accept it as like, yeah, sure, that's okay. Well, as professional software developers, that's not how we should be building things. It's not what we should be doing. And I'm certainly not on the side of like, everything's got to be perfect polished and, your code's got to be, 8 layers of abstraction so that each method is a single line. Like, no, there's a balance in here.
So what do we call the unclean code? So, okay, obviously the premise is that we don't allow unclean code, or the code that we allow into the system, it has to be working, it has to be sort of clean, but maybe it is, a revision or two before we get the ideal end goal,
Yeah.
but it is meeting our requirements for today.
Yep.
And that's we have some technical debt there. What about all of that other crap that is, already in? So today we all agree, hey, from now on, we're no longer putting crap into the system.
Yep.
What about the stuff in the system already? What do we call that, and how do we deal with that?
So the word that I use for that is cruft. And if you look it up in the dictionary, one of the actual definitions is old, shoddy, redundant, or poorly written code. So it is the only word that I know that for that stuff, cruft. I used to just call it a mess, but and that's what I encourage folks is recognize that you've got crufty code. Develop a strategy for remediating that which needs to be remediated, and go forward doing better behavior. If I've got 100,000 lines of code and it's a lot of cruft, and 80% of that code base hasn't been touched in the last 3 years, and it just does the job. Yeah, it's gnarly. I don't really want to go in there, but I don't have to. Don't go back and fix it. You're actually adding risk to the project. The moment that you need to do something to add new features, new functionality, well, okay, then let's character test it and let's get it cleaned up. And but
So what about talking to the business though and characterizing that risk? So like when the business comes back and says, okay, this is a project, a legacy project, it's very crufty. Now they're coming in and going, oh well, we do actually have 3 years later, 20 years later, we've discovered that we would like this new feature coming in, and we're going, okay, well, in order to do that, we're going to have to make these changes. Whether we make them cleanly or not, like there's still going to be an inherent risk. Technical debt was sort of a term that I feel like people helped leverage that risk to those business folks. Will they understand cruft in the same way, or is there both technical debt and cruft here kind of in this situation?
Yeah, so there's probably a little bit of both, right? So there is the technical debt in terms of like we've now discovered that there is again a gap between what's been implemented and what is desired. So there, by some affordance of the original definition is technical debt. The problem is that definition also assumed clean code. That aspect we don't currently have, and I think it's they're not easy conversations to have, but I think it is a conversation about, hey, you know what, this code's been around for a long time. We know a lot of things now that we didn't know then, and if we really want to add this functionality and make sure that we've got the same safety here that we do around all of our other code, we're going to have to take these extra steps. And it is it's not always an easy discussion, but it should be. Hopefully you've been writing clean, well-composed code and have built some trust,
Let's say hypothetically that, and I say that sort of facetiously, but also there's a lot of code out there that was written with unrealistic deadlines and with and by people that didn't feel comfortable pushing back the amount that maybe they needed to or should have. I know that we're a relatively young industry. We have kind of co-opted some words and terms and roles. My sister, whose husband is an architect with building materials, got mad at me the first time she heard reference to a software architect, because that's not a thing. Ash was at least studying aeronautical engineering, and engineer is a term that elicits understanding of precision, whereas software is relatively young and continues to evolve very, very quickly, and the need for software developers is so great that anyone that can type effectively and can learn enough on the job can get a job and produce something. And if those that are mentoring them and teaching them along the way aren't teaching them clean code and best practices, then we're kind of all responsible for the state of our industry.
I agree, and I do think that this you've identified a pretty key contributing factor. You look at the 90s into the early noughts, and we're learning a lot. We're learning a lot about what it means to not have type safety in certain types of languages. We're learning a lot about a lot of different things in TDD, and some really good stuff comes out of that in terms of how do we create this safety for ourselves. And then right as we're sort of at that point of, hey, we've learned some really good stuff here. It hasn't yet made it into schools, right? The colleges aren't teaching it, but we now as an industry know it. The industry just starts to explode and doesn't stop. And people coming in aren't learning this stuff, and the growth rate has been so significant that those that know it can't keep up with those matriculating in, and so you get these isolated pockets where if you want to join ThoughtWorks, right, you've got to pass a certain, set of criteria. And there's companies that hold those standards, and then, but there aren't as many of those as there are if you can sling code, you're a software developer. And then if you get hired here, you're now a software engineer, because that's the title we use.
Yep. Yeah. And I know that there's an argument though that we have a need and we can get it done with a pencil and paper. We can get it done with Excel and Access databases. We don't need the computer scientists.
Right. So do we need, algorithm specialists? Maybe not, not in all cases. Does the job still need to be done well? I mean, I don't know. I think, every field has gone through this. It's just that our field is growing, is moving so fast. So, the medical industry took how many years to go from, things like no one washes their hands to some of us do to everyone washes their hands. And, all of these kind of standard leading practices that became just what they do. Even civil engineering, medical engineering, all of those fields had that same kind of growth path where artisans, practitioners, non-licensing, eventually licensing. I'm not keen on the idea of that happening in our industry. But at the same time, if we look at Canada, there are software engineers. You are a licensed engineer. There is an actual there's an oath that you take to uphold a certain professional standard, and there's accountability to that. And you can be stripped of your, engineering license or whatever I'm probably using the wrong terms and I apologize for that, but the concept you get.
Yeah, sure.
You can be stripped of that and you can actually be removed from your ability to perform that job. And man, there's days when I look at the code bases of the places that, I'm trying to help, or, even in a lot of the open source. And I start to think maybe we do need to do this.
It's a tough call because there's a never ending need for more people who can write code. And businesses, they care about the end results. They don't care what the code looks like as long as it does the thing that they need. And they're completely unaware of the potential risks from bad code in certain situations. And so if we can't inform them, or if they don't trust us, if they don't believe that we are professionals, then they're just going to charge forward on their money-making machine. And there's always going to be a developer sitting by waiting to do whatever it is that their business is asking them to do.
I think some what you point out is that it's a misunderstanding of what they're getting. An inability to recognize good code from bad code works by some measure is what maybe we're after. And my experience, honestly, is that when you go into organizations, it's a rare CEO, CTO, VP that is actually standing on a hill somewhere saying, forget quality, make it happen. Somewhere in the middle, as we establish measures that we're looking at and ways that we ascertain if a manager is doing well, we create these incentive systems that by the time it gets to the team, it's, who cares about quality? Just get it done. I don't think it's unfortunate.
Yeah.
I think it's unfortunate.
It really is. But it's at least the conclusion that I've come up to over time is that it's an extremely tough cookie to crack, right? Or tough nut to crack. It's something that there's so many levels of that got to that point that it's really difficult to make a change in any decent sized organization.
I'm actually having a lot of fun right now. So this is part of what we are. I'm actively working on is at a large organization, really looking at how do we help to affect this change. And it's similar work that I did with Groupon, but it's at a much larger scale. And it's a lot about culture. It's a lot about community. It's a lot about how do you make information available? How do you help leaders understand the impact of the things that they're doing, as well as helping, the individuals that are writing the code understand the impact of the way that they're approaching the problems. So it is a tough problem.
So is any of that sort of wisdom and information you're bringing in your new book, Escape Velocity? Is that were you talking about metrics for better agile teams, or what's that book about?
Yeah, I would say yes. There's a lot of that that's in that book. So the book is interesting. It's at least in pretense about metrics, and certainly I talk about metrics in it. But really, it ended up being kind of a long or short, depending on what you think. But it ended up being kind of a more of just a rant on agility in general. So the entire beginning of it was it started years ago watching as newly minted Scrum Masters were joining teams and immediately focusing on velocity. And one of the first things that would happen is like, hey, I noticed that our velocity is 14, and that's pretty good, but I did the burn down, and it turns out that we're not going to make the deadline. But if your velocity was 17, then we'd make the deadline. Can you please make it 17?
Yeah.
And this doesn't lead to very good behavior. I started researching, why does it not lead to good behavior? Like, what is it about that, right? So I came across the Hawthorne effect. I came across Goodhart's law, and other things that actually like prove why we shouldn't be setting goals for velocity. But then even like velocity itself is not a very good metric. It doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't tell you, I mean, it's throughput, right? That's really all it is. We just gave it a new name, but it doesn't help me to diagnose any team problems, et cetera. So in Escape Velocity, that's kind of where it started, was saying like, hey, let's just move away from this metric altogether. Here's other things that we could do. Let's look at flow. Let's look at the way that we actually are leading teams, the way that we are, thinking about the work. And there is a good bit in there, even about for leaders and managers. I talk about the impact of setting, just the fact that you're measuring something. You have observer bias, and you have a bias just around the fact that you're being measured, which is going to change the system. You've got something like which is really Hawthorne effect. You've got something like Goodhart's law, which basically, when you take a measure and you set a target for it, the measure ceases to be good anymore. But it turns out that also, if you don't have to set a target for a measure, if you incentivize a measure, just do things like, hey, I saw that your throughput went from 14 to 17. Good job. That's a signal. That's a signal in the system, and that will actually change behavior. So there's some stuff in there around that as well, just trying to help leaders understand a little bit more what they can do to not create these perverse incentives where teams are now actually hurting the system instead of helping it.
Yeah, I've actually had that job a number of different times where the points were the thing, the commodity being sold to the customer, to the client.
Yeah.
And it was very much incentivized. We need to sell them more points. Yeah. Okay, well, let's figure out how we can cut those corners and sell them more points, or let's figure out how we can inflate those numbers to make sure that the customer gets the points they expect to get.
Yeah,
I'm really looking forward to the time where we can get back to we're delivering value to our clients and customers. We're talking with them. We're figuring out what the next most valuable, important feature is to them. We are doing our due diligence to figure out this is the range of time that we think it will take, and we expect to deliver that feature in that range of time.
Yep. Yeah, and I see organizations that are moving in that direction, where really trying to get the teams a little bit closer to what are the business problems that we're solving? What are the key metrics for those business problems? How would we know? What are ways that we can get creative to help solve those problems? Software delivery teams that are actually solving problems without writing software because they recognize that, like, wait, we don't need to do something custom. We could actually just do this, and then you guys can continue to import it into your Excel sheets that you've always used, or whatever, right? And I think that's really that's very positive, and it's exciting to see. As you know, but again, as we've been discussing, there's a lot of places where that isn't happening yet.
Yeah.
And the idea of selling points is just it's hilarious, and it's really sad at the same time. I don't know if you guys so story points kind of came out of XP, and then Scrum kind of, I think, absconded with them and gave them a new name. And I don't remember what the exact origin was, but a few years ago, Ron Jeffries was like, look, if I didn't invent them, I was certainly one of the members of the group that sort of, started the whole thing with story points. And he came out and basically said, I apologize. Like we were doing the best that we could have at the time. And now that I'm looking back, I wish we'd never done it. And Ron doesn't use story points for anything. And what I'm finding, what I've been finding consistently is the discussion still adds value for a lot of folks. Mm-hmm. How big do we think this is? But the actual number is useless, and actually, in a lot of cases, it really just leads to bad behavior. So I've been for years discouraging teams from actually using points. Everything's just a one. Let's look at flow. And that's been working out fine. And there's a lot of advancements now. We're borrowing stuff from other industries, and the way that we forecast these days is significantly better, and doesn't require points or any of that kind of funky goofiness.
Yeah. Along those lines, what are the types of things that can help us move in the right direction?
Yeah, so honestly, I think that one of the things that I found to be super beneficial is actually the forecasting this change. So you probably heard about it. Troy McGinnis has a series of podcasts, blog posts, and resources available around forecasting. What he's done is he's built a Monte Carlo simulation system for forecasting for teams. So you actually get a probability distribution, and you get an understanding of like, all right, if we're targeting this date, we've got a 55 to 70% probability of hitting it. If we can extend by a couple of weeks, then we've got an 85 to 100% probability of hitting that. So it's leading to really good conversations with teams. The other thing that I've noticed is I've taken this and I've backcast it, and I've done some other work with it. One, it works. It's pretty reliable. Two, it turns out that the velocity math that we've been using all along is on average between 45 and 55% probability.
Yes.
So it's a coin toss. We've been forecasting on a coin toss this entire time. So yes. Like that, in terms of a team being able to suddenly, deliver what they said they could when they said they could, significant improvement without all of the pressure that comes from 50% probability, right? That's made a huge difference, I think, in a lot of places. Is in building the trust, in building the confidence. I don't know if that's what you're looking for, but that's certainly one thing.
Yeah. At least part of that. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, at least part of that reminded me of an article I read years and years ago on Joel Spolsky's blog post or blog site where he had evidence-based scheduling. So it's basically like give a developer a same-sized work item 100 times and see how long it takes them to complete it. Take the average of those times, the high and the low, and then you can use that to forecast ongoing work within a probability.
Right.
And he had that whole graph, and that was, oh goodness,
yeah.
It was like 10 years ago at this point. And I've shown that to several of the business people that I work with, and it's never gone anywhere yet. But
yeah, and what Joel's talking about, and you can do this too with just like a basic lead time distribution, right? So let's say that you're actually still pointing stuff, fine, whatever. Great. Then what is the lead time for all of the stories of this size, and just a simple histogram. It's not hard to do, but then you actually get a probability distribution, and then you can look at it and say, oh, okay, well, if I want, 80% or higher confidence this is going to be done, then I've got to be looking at the high end of the graph. And actually, one of the things that you'll discover is that graph is not a Gaussian curve. It's not, your standard bell. It's actually a shifted Weibull. So you've got a high concentration near the front, and then you've got a really long tail on that. And it's because, think about your commute home. Well, of course, these days our commute home is usually, but back in the days when people traveled to get to work, let's say your average drive is 15 minutes. Well, okay, cool. If your average drive is 15 minutes, is there a day that you could get home in 12? Yeah, possibly. Could you get home in 10? Seems unlikely.
Right.
Could you get home in 5? Impossible. Couldn't be done. Could it take you 90 minutes? Absolutely. Absolutely. So, the longer side of that scale is actually, has some probability to it, whereas the shorter side doesn't. Anyway, so you can do that distribution, and then you can use that. And that's basically what Joel was talking about. Taking the averages, and the reason I mentioned the shape times, and then start thinking about, how long will it take?
So I guess you also mentioned, not using story points. How are you still sizing these tasks, right? So like you still have to come up with an idea of a task that's the same size as another task, right? So we still have to be able to put these things. And then I guess another question would be, how do you deal with hours? Because that's ultimately what the project manager wants, is right. How many hours is this thing going to take?
I think our connection went bad.
Choking on the question. Yeah, I don't. Yeah, just tell them 2 weeks. No, these are valid because they're realities in different environments, right? So typically, like, I don't do the pointing. I might still do some kind of a comparative sizing. A lot of times we're looking at we've created some kind of a story map. We've thought about the slicing of the stories both along the user journey in a very kind of what's an end-to-end vertical slice of value, and then or horizontal slice of value. Then we start thinking about how can we slice that in thin vertical slices. So we've got relatively small pieces as it is. We might then do some kind of example mapping. And that example mapping is going to get us down to even more detail, and that oftentimes reveals yet another place that we can actually split these stories. And so all I'm looking for is, can we get down to atomic units of value? Like, we don't think this can be any smaller and actually offer value good enough.
Okay.
And so I'm relying more on the means by which we got to small stories than I am on, we have a bunch of stories. Do we think they're about the same size?
Okay. Yeah. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I appreciate that.
Sure. Yeah. And then the hours thing, I don't know what to tell you.
Well, so I think that those get answered by sort of what we're talking about. If you can break it down into that atomic value that you're talking, and then you can utilize something like how quickly have we actually completed these atomic size things?
Right.
Now you actually have your data, and you can extrapolate that using the statistics that you're talking about to how quickly will we be able to get these 5 atomic size pieces completed in the future.
Yeah, a lot of it is, and manage WIP, and just, looking at what this, it's hard to have really smooth flow. We're not making widgets, right? It's not the same thing over and over again. And if we were, we'd automate it, because that's what we do. When it's repeatable, we make it go away. But if we can get relatively consistent flow, then it gets even easier. We can just, what's the average lead time on a story? Okay, well, how many stories are in front of this one? Okay, here's when this one's going to be done. Like, you can use Little's law and very easily determine when a story will make it through the system. or there's more sophisticated Monte Carlo forecasting, et cetera.
Sure. Are there tools that you can recommend for people to help in this process, or?
Yeah, absolutely. So the stuff from Troy McGinnis I really like, and it's a downloadable, it's Excel spreadsheet. I will make sure to follow up and provide you guys a link via email, because the URL just changed recently. They did they did a refresh of their site, and so I don't remember it off the top of my head. I remember that it changed. I just don't remember to what. But I will share that so that it ends up in show notes. And then of course, buy my book, right? But sorry, that was gratuitous. Yeah. You can take it out.
No, that's perfect. Okay. One of the things that we sort of ask everyone, all the guests that come on, is if they would sort of look over their careers and say, pick out the words of wisdom that would give our listeners who are maybe just getting started sort of that leg up. So do you have anything specific that you kind of could tell them just in general?
Man, I have been, I've been fortunate to have exposure to a lot of really good folks. I've been able to be kind of in the right place at the right time numerous times. So that's a tough one. Like, what's the one piece, right? That's something that I think. All right, so there's two things that stuck with me. One is as a developer, and that was, I don't remember exactly who it was that said it to me, but know the problem you're trying to solve. Right? Whatever it is that you're trying to do, make sure that you understand what's the actual need here. Don't just take a requirement and accept it and implement it. Know why. And then as a coach, the best advice I got, and I've shortened it, but this was from a mentor of mine a few years ago, and that is always solve the pain they know they have. So a lot of times as coaches, when we come into an organization, someone says, "Hey, I need you to come in and teach everyone how to do TDD," and we do a quick check. We do an assessment or something, and we go, "Yeah, TDD is not really what they need. What they actually need is, better story sizing from their product owners." So we go back and we say, "Hey, we've done some work. We decided that really what you need is better story sizing from your product owners." And usually what happens is they go, "Thanks for the assessment," and they don't call you back. And I didn't understand, like, how could this be? And my friend said, "Well, all right, imagine that you go to a doctor and you have, let's just say that you have diabetes, and you go in and you say, 'Hey, I want insulin.' And the doctor says, 'Insulin, right? Okay, so we're going to put you on a diet, and we're going to give you some exercise routine, and we're going to maintain certain water levels, and then maybe, what are you going to do?' Most of us are going to go find another doctor."
Right.
And that's exactly what was happening for me. It's like, you know what? If you really want to build trust and you really want to help these folks, solve the pain that they know they have, and go from there. Meet them where they are, and lead them to another place. All right, that's enough aphorisms.
All right, and if our listeners wanted to reach out to you, what's the best way for them to get a hold of you, or just to follow the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so I'm Doc on Dev everywhere. DOCONDEV. That's my blog. That's me on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, etc. And then, of course, we've got good material over at onbelay.co as well.
Great. And what's next for you, assuming we can all leave our houses at some point?
Yeah.
Do you have anything special on the horizon for you?
So I'm hoping to be able to do the opening keynote for Agile Testing Days in November in Germany, if that's still happening. The U.S. one was postponed for a year. So if Germany doesn't happen, then I'll be doing, I think, February in Chicago. Other than that, working on the Clean Coder video and I'm actually starting on another book, but I'm not ready to talk about it too much yet. So, but it'll take up a good amount of time because they usually do.
Yeah.
So,
Well, maybe we can have you back on when that you're ready to talk about that one.
that'd be cool. So give me 7 years.
Perfect. It's a date.
All right.
All right. Thanks, Doc. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today.
Yeah. Thank you.
That was Doc Norton. Doc is co-founder at On Belay, performing organizational and leadership coaching to companies for whom software is key.
If you like this episode, please like, rate, and review on iTunes.
Find show notes, blog posts, and more at sixfiguredev.com.
And catch us live on Twitch, and be sure to follow us on Twitter at sixfiguredev.
This has been another episode of the Six Figure Developer Podcast, helping others reach their potential. I am John Calloway.
I am Clayton Hunt.
And I'm John Ash.